Hi, everyone. Given the number of participants, I can guarantee we'll get to all of your questions before we end today. My name is George Tolomiczenko. Up until the beginning of February, I was part of the UCI team, linking UCI with CHALK, and physically located in the Beal Center for Applied Innovation. Really learned a lot and was jazzed about working at UCI, and I would really very much like to continue to be connected with UCI. And one example is this talk. So I was invited recently to talk about translational research, and it's a topic near and dear to my heart. I am now moved over from UCI to Caltech, and there I'm the first director of the newly founded Merkin Institute for Translational Research. So I work with Professor Barbara Wald and the physician in residence Dan Schwartz, and entrepreneurs in residence Helen McBride and Julie Schoenfeld to really connect the research activities of faculty, postgrads and grads and undergrads at Caltech with the outside world, and also further the research internally. I'll talk more about that in just a bit. So we're brand new, and one of the things that I'm working on is our website, which this is a bit of a preview, because if you go looking for it now, you won't find it. If you're familiar with Caltech and haven't been there for a while, this is our home on the old, one of the older buildings in the on campus is the William Kirchhoff Research Labs for Biology and Biological Engineering. And when you visit me on campus, when those days are back again, you will find me on the second floor through this door next to the Morgan Library. So I invite you to connect because this is knowledge translation is always a team sport, and it's both a team sport in the sense that you're on a team, and it's also a team sport in that you're competing with other teams. And I'm just gonna, I really hyped up the recent book called Code Breaker by Walter Isaacson about Jennifer Doudna. I'm gonna get to that, and in some ways it becomes more of an assignment than an actual discussion topic. But as you will have, if you've read that book, learned again, because it's a message that I'm sure many of you know, that is that friction and competition between teams is pretty important. And in science, you always have players sort of moving from one team to another, one coast to another, and I'm certainly an example of that. And the other thing too is, I'm just going to do a quick check. I think there are few enough participants. If you do have questions, I mean, I don't mind being interrupted, and we can do a bit of that too. Here's a slide that I put together because in presenting previously, I've never really talked about myself. And here I'm putting it all literally out on the line, right? So I saw this and I thought, why don't I just get these fridge magnets? This is a fridge magnet depiction of my career. And I have this because there are a few lessons here that might be worthwhile. First of all, why am I interested in translating research? Well, I've been translating research from one area to another from the very beginning of my career. So these cards are numbered. We can go from the lower right, as I look at my screen, hopefully that's the same, to the top right, zigzagging across. So number one, even as a graduate student, I was working as a research director for a home-based family treatment team in the Boston area, and I loved it because I learned, what life was like in the real world while I was immersed in my graduate studies. And so I trained in clinical psychology with a strong emphasis on research methodology and statistics. So I was lured back to Canada, where I'm from originally. Oh, by the way, the other thing is I did my undergraduate work at Caltech. So from Caltech, I went to Boston to be in the PhD program in clinical psychology. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but what I want to illustrate is, the bit of a border hopping between 1 and 2, and then in Toronto, I was always affiliated with the University of Toronto, first with psychiatry and then health policy and management and evaluation. So that's, believe it or not, that's just one department. So I started my career as a research methodologist for the Health Systems Research and Consulting Unit. So there I was joining a team to work at the interface between academia and hospitals and services provided to special needs populations. So I went there focused on homelessness and mental health, and how do we house people who are with serious mental illness who need housing. Everyone needs housing, but who needs housing tailored so that they can survive and thrive without being institutionalized. So this was my next career step. So after working in Boston at the Harvard Medical School on a giant NIH grant that looked at those questions, I was recruited to a position in Toronto, where I'm from originally. So went back to Toronto. Then I went from psychiatry to research in a general hospital with a teaching affiliation. That's the St. Joseph Cards, number 4. From there, I branched off into an area of work that was brand new to me. It's the development of life sciences in the Toronto region. So I became a regional economic advisor, research director, and versed in the kinds of things you need to know to facilitate knowledge translation. Again, bringing industry, academia together so that we could create companies at this point, and using the particular attributes of a region that would be attractive to companies. So I learned about that back in Toronto. From there, I went to funding research in more of a public health focus, but from the standpoint of a disease-focused sponsor of research. So this number 6 card is the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of Canada. So I was beginning to work with researchers and clinicians both to decide where to put money down to foster research. And that began very traditionally with the kinds of research that university people, staff and researchers would submit applications for. But by the time I ended there, I was beginning to create partnerships with large companies who were interested in the area. So Vertex Pharmaceutical, for example. So that really whetted my appetite to do more of the actual sort of connecting academia and industry. So and that is one avenue of knowledge. And I'm using the term knowledge translation, but at this point, so translational research. From that job, I came back to California to start education program for engineers and medical students to work together to think about, right from the beginning of their PhDs or their MDs, how they would work on teams to create solutions for needs-based or need-focused problems. So first, find out what problem needs to be solved and ought to be solved based on a variety of different considerations, and I could get into that a bit. And I did that with Dr. Sanger, who a year ago we co-presented, and Dr. Sanger is Chief Scientific Officer at Children's Hospital Orange County now. I learned with him and implemented this program at USC, which we ran for about 10 years, and which graduated students that have since done pretty amazing things that have circled back, including some circling back during the year I was at UCI. And that's the next card, UCI, where Director of Medical Innovations. It was, I was quite sort of at the interface between different schools, centers, people, activities. So it was quite a busy role. And then COVID hit. Now the slide number 9, card number 9 is not the COVID card. It's just the Caltech card because I haven't gotten it yet. I just started 2 months ago, and these kinds of things are not available at this point. But I put this slide together just to show you that I think, I heard one person comment that someone graduating these days ought to expect that they'll probably wind up working in 10 different roles during their lifetime. Well, I've been in it. Actually, this is a subset, almost complete, but pretty much 9 different roles, or approaching 10. And one of the things that I really and it's advice that I give to graduate students, undergrads, is that's pretty much what you need to expect. You need to sort of see your future as a series of projects that you undertake in different contexts. And so this sort of fuels this idea that we're learning to be a team player, learning how to add value to your team, and shifting from one team to another is part of what it means to be a contributor to knowledge translation, or translational research all along the way. Why don't I'll do a quick stop here for any kind of questions. I don't know, Emily, do we still have a small enough number of people that we can just do open questions and answers? Is that okay?
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to write them in the chat box, and then I can read them to you, George. But it looks like nobody has any questions right now.
Okay. So even though the title of the talk is more knowledge or research translation, I keep sort of using knowledge translation. It tells you a little bit about my bias about the university side, but it's been something that's been important to me since, for the entire time I was working in sort of high level roles in Canada, and it continues to be a theme because I'm currently serving for the Canadian Institutes of Health Research as an institute advisor for the Institute of Nutrition, Metabolism, and Diabetes. So once you become, eager and adept at translating knowledge in funding research that it has translational potential, namely moving from the bed to the bedside, from the bench to the bedside, you wind up being included in sort of advisory groups for continuing efforts in those areas. So in Canada, there's a very concentrated sort of effort to define what it means to work in the area of knowledge translation. Every institute has people devoted to this. So there are different activities that are tailored to the institute, each institute. So, but all of them are aiming ultimately to create a dynamic and iterative process. So, synthesis is putting knowledge together in a way that's relevant for different needs, like, a policymaker's needs might be different than someone else who is on a panel to create best practice guidelines for treatment for a particular illness. They need to do knowledge synthesis to bring all that relevant information together. Dissemination, how do you get the word out? I mean, we're under, lots of different sort of changes in dissemination, especially during COVID, for example, when the acceleration of getting stuff out there and in the public so people can review, read, and contribute their own perspective has been, hugely accelerated. The exchange in terms of, having some sort of market for, I need to know more about this. How can I find out who is willing to sort of do research about this? and then ethically sound application of knowledge. It's always a consideration. And one of the ways of thinking about this is more of a general ecology that includes both researchers who generate knowledge and also knowledge users. And that is an important sort of consideration. What originally attracted me to this was my work in homelessness and mental illness, because just on a personal note, when I first set out to work in this area, my role, I started out kind of at the level of a research assistant, doing diagnostic interviewing with people who had or were in facilities for people suffering with severe mental illness. So diagnoses like major depression, manic depression, schizophrenia of different subtypes were common, and I would interview people using what was called the structured clinical interview for diagnosis back for DSM-3. That was quite some time ago. But what I really learned was to appreciate the viewpoint of the individuals themselves who were trying to, in the midst of suffering from major mental illness, trying to navigate how to access services, how to find a place to live, a roof, shelter that was stable, and how to shape those services to best fit the needs of individuals. So I was very much interested in this concept of knowledge users, because the people who ran halfway houses, halfway house in the sense of being discharged from inpatient mental health to a place to live on your way to getting some kind of employment potentially, but many people were living off of SSDI payments at the time. So I really learned the whole sort of US system for caring for people with severe mental illness. But those who took, so social workers, program managers who took care of people with severe mental illness were the knowledge users I was keen to understand, so that I could help make recommendations about programming, how to interact with people so that they could sort of improve their quality of life and move on. So this is what my early sort of experience in this area was, and I transferred that when I moved from Boston, where I was doing that work, up to Toronto, where my research at the time was like, how do we consider personality factors to assess how and what type of housing would be appropriate for specific individuals. So knowledge translation in terms of how do we change what we know about service provisions for people with mental illness to tailor it for people with those kinds of special needs. And this has been, so most recently, I've reviewed grant applications for mental health provision for during the time of COVID, mental health and substance abuse disorders treatment in this particular time too. So I'm still on the side doing some of that work. One of the things that's happening is a reframing of just this effort of knowledge translation to knowledge mobilization, and the motivating piece for this is, how do we actually make not so much translating knowledge, because it's not so much moving from one language to another or one set of language users to another. It's like, how do we mobilize it? How do we actually make a difference in what we do and how we serve people, how we treat patients, how we understand illness in a way that's more action oriented? And it's a wider umbrella, I would argue, because it actually encompasses more of the commercialization aspects of knowledge, translational research, for example. So, a wider range of activities related to making evidence accessible, understandable, and useful for informing decisions about health policies, practices, and programs, and rearrange some of that. And so, one of the things I, obviously noticed, it's not a linear knowledge transfer problem. So, it's not just, researchers pushing research out and it finding some place to link up with needs. As I said, when I came back to California to start the program at USC with Dr. Sanger, that was because I knew how important it was to understand the pull side of this. And this began also in my work with homelessness and mental illness in Canada, where I said, we need to find a way of getting the news out or getting the important lessons we learn about research out to our knowledge users sooner rather than later. Because typically you get funded for some research, you set it up, it takes time to do, and then you get your data, you analyze it. By the time that those results come back in the form of an article that someone has to pick up and read and understand, oh, maybe I should house homeless people with severe mental illness in a different way from what I originally thought, it could be 6 or 7 years. Meanwhile, there's a job to be done, namely, how do we work with homeless people now? So what I included in my research was an iterative approach involving knowledge users so that they could see interim results of our research, they could ask questions, and we could readjust the kinds of information, data, and analyses that we were going to do later to fit the needs of the knowledge users. And I say knowledge users, and that sometimes include, and why that was so useful was that in Toronto, after I had done a lot of research in Boston, people would ask me, well, why should we let researchers come in? These people with severe mental illness who need housing, they've been researched up the wazoo, right? Or, just in the sense that, they were being protective. And so I had to work with them to say, well, what are your questions on their behalf? Or what are your assumptions on their behalf, so that I can understand better how to not just help them, but also help you help them, right? So again, really changing the interaction. And this is why, to me, knowledge mobilization, and I think it's in a slide that follows, sorry, now I'm pressing too far ahead. Knowledge mobilization also encompasses this idea that you need to have include the knowledge users in defining the problems. And this has been a lesson you can translate and transfer to global health issues, for example. When I was running the health technology and engineering program at USC, I was asked, can you come and talk about using your principles and the methodology of needs-based engineering solutions in the global health context? And one of the things I made sure of was to make that the end users, those people in the countries where these efforts were launched, were involved in mobilizing the knowledge. In other words, it wasn't a solution that was imposed upon people. It was a solution that was co-created with those persons' input. That do that from the beginning. It's the only way there'll be a fit, and it's the only way it'll stick. If you don't do that, you get some results that might be unintended consequences. So the best sort of motivations to help could get turned into results that are suboptimal, and there are a variety of different sort of examples of that. I don't know if anyone might, if you're curious about that, let me know, and I'll put it in the chat, and I can give an example. But I also knew from my experience at the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation funding research that I had to educate researchers about the importance of knowledge mobilization. So they, both in communicating what ultimately the value of the research was, but also for their sake, how do you bundle this research in a way that would make it of interest to people in industry? So if you're working on microbial communities and the connection between that kind of science and inflammatory bowel disease, well, maybe a yogurt company or a probiotic company might be interested in that kind of research, and making it understandable and making that knowledge sort of translatable and transferable to that context would be of interest too. And again, one of the many threads that sort of connected me back to California was this research sponsorship that I was doing at the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of Canada at the time. Any questions in the chat at this time, Emily?
There's no questions right now, but if anybody has any, feel free again to put them in the chat or use the Q&A box.
Okay, thanks. Another sort of model that's used often is this T5 perspective. So, and this is a slide that connects, and this is more familiar here in the US. Oftentimes this T0 through T5 scale is used to sort of situate knowledge or research translation at different stages of application. So at the beginning, what are the targets, biomarkers, genes, pathways, mechanism, so the total sort of basic science foundation upon everything, upon which everything else rests. So that's why you can do some of that work in mouse models, and then T1, the differentiation there is like first in human trials. So phase 1, phase 2, just safety, and then basic efficacy, proof of concept, and then onward down to by the very end, T5, application to on a societal level. So improving not just health, but also the sort of culture in which more of this can happen, basically. So one of the things that makes my current new job challenging is that what the Richard Merkin Institute of Translational Research ultimately aims is to be a supporter of translational research at any point in this spectrum, right? So there's a very sort of broad arc from basic mechanistic research to access to healthcare, for instance, right? So from T0 to T5, there's a lot of things that that need to happen, and happen in very different ways, and are contextually sort of sensitive, that to be responsive and to help with that translation, it's really important to understand these nuances. Yeah, so and again, one of the things that this slide is doing is kind of like the DNA, where it's interweaving the one T0 to T5 model with the knowledge mobilization model. There are different meanings at each stage for knowledge mobilization. What do you need to do with the end goal of mobilizing knowledge to do at each of these stages? And it's quite different activities. So one of the things that is very exciting about the prospect, although it can be scary to think about, if you're starting out in your your career trajectory that, oh my goodness, I'm going to have 9 or 10 different careers. Yeah, why not? Because you get the opportunity to kind of do different things in different contexts and learn these things. In some ways, it's sort of a career version of traveling. And during the COVID year, any version of traveling is exciting. That's, I mean, that I'll just continue here. And one of the things, and again, this is a point that I'm saying, including again, because I wanted to make it that you can see that there are multiple valleys of death, basically. What a wonderful metaphor. But moving from basic biomedical research to clinical science and knowledge is one valley. But then how do we take that further and make an impact on clinical practice, right? So depending upon your role in the translational research process, you do different things and you handle maybe Valley 1, maybe Valley 2, maybe the other valley, namely the technology adoption sort of metaphor. Like how, now that you have a new technology, how do we get users on board with it? And then, and that in the medical sphere requires another set of considerations, another sort of group of players. So, where, the regulatory and reimbursement people are in some ways very importantly involved in crossing those valleys as well. Yeah, I'm just thinking, all right, so one of the activities, this second valley, where you're moving from clinical science and knowledge to health decision making and clinical practice. This is an interesting one. Reflecting on this is interesting in the context of COVID as well, because it really assumes that clinical science and knowledge is a stable sort of footing. So if you switch metaphors slightly in terms of, instead of crossing a valley, but you're actually doing some rock climbing or something like that, you think you have a stable footing in the clinical science and knowledge piece. But if the context is such that people are not so confident in experts and feel that the whole sort of issue around fake news, people being influenced by pseudoscience, all of these things that we as scientists feel we have enough protective measures, peer review process, and just a way of making sure that science is solid. If you can't assume that, it's even harder to navigate from, along the way from clinical science and knowledge. So, you people get second guessing, for instance, the effectiveness of masks, wearing masks during COVID. And we saw some very upsetting behavior and continue in some ways to see that. And how do we change those behaviors? Very important area of knowledge, transfer, knowledge, mobilization, and translational research. All of these sort of are important considerations. And then, so this in some ways gets to my point about being sure that you have a solid foundation from which you are mobilizing knowledge. So it's not just sort of hearsay. It's not just sort of in one, sort of purely expert opinion. You want to get to the level of gold standards, such as, sort of randomized controlled trials, meta-analyses, and systematic reviews of material that has been done in a rigorous way, and that has withstood the scrutiny of peer review, and that's where you want to place your footing for the next step toward translating that research into products, services, and ultimately policies that help guide the organization of services as well. Any questions at this point? I can just look at the I don't see an increment in the little red number, so I'm assuming the answer is no, right, Emily?
Yes, no questions yet.
Yes, no questions. Okay. All right. Okay, so here's a slide that I've included mainly because it at least lists some different sort of, in these boxes, different people and perhaps different members of the audience right now come from each of these areas. So, technology transfer and commercialization was an important function of people down the hall from where I was back at UCI, Beal Applied Innovation. They connecting also with ULP, but the UCI programs like Wayfinder to help move ideas toward commercialization pathways, to form companies, to understand the kinds of supports that are out there if you're thinking about starting a company, to connect with the I-Corps program that train people in sort of business model canvas, the need for customer discovery, customer development. All of these things are happening in some ways in the sort of broad umbrella of technology transfer, because transferring or translating research through technology is something that's that sometimes people see that as science. Science isn't science until you have a microscope which you can see tiny cells for the first time, as Leeuwenhoek did. All these important tools up to and including CRISPR-Cas9 technology that allows gene editing, for example, right? So these are all sort of similar kind of, sometimes they're often called revolutions, but in some ways it's like new tools to the kit, right? And so less glamorous, but also less dangerous in some ways too. This is why I again go back to the toolkit of knowledge mobilization, the kind of different kinds of metaphors and tools that I started to sort of find and develop on my own in my research, and see that they're quite relevant now. Again, you need to sort of work with what you have, and at the same time, that's a changing toolkit, and I think that's one of the things that we do in knowledge and in translational research, and on a day-to-day basis. I mean, in some ways, I'm hesitating now because it's like, to me, it's like, how do I put this into words? My habits of a lifetime. So there you go. So sharing knowledge, getting out in front of audiences like I'm doing now, and making sure researchers sort of hear back about what's important. So one example I'll give to that is, not everyone who does research is the best communicator of that research. So when I was with the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, if I interacted with a researcher who really was good at sharing knowledge in a way that made it accessible, appealing, and motivating. The motivating at that time also meant, making sure that people wanted to donate to fund more research. And so if you found someone who is a natural communicator, it was good because they could sort of interact with family members of people who had inflammatory bowel disease, and it was. I remember people coming up to me afterwards saying, one of the things that I really appreciate is, you're organizing this event, bringing the scientists to us, because, with people like her working on issues that are affecting my child. Even if there's not a cure tomorrow, I know there will be in the future. So that kind of motivation, really important function for scientists as well. And so these are different sort of roles. And part of the reason why I include this is one of the things that I really appreciated during my time at UCI was just how many talented graduate students were out in the UCI community who are looking for different kinds of roles in to contribute to science. And I think you really can be creative in finding roles, and I think it's really important to kind of cultivate a network of people who can inform you about what are possible type roles. We all think we know what our next job will be, but oftentimes it's more of a stochastic process in which it's important to sort of be open to new possibilities from that arise within your network. Most jobs actually come that way. Anyway, I wasn't sure the audience of this event who it might be, so I wanted to include a little bit about that as well. This is going back a bit, but a little bit of a review about knowledge users. And one of the points I kept talking about was how, in my own research, I sort of fell into doing what at the bottom of this slide is called integrated knowledge mobilization. So I made an effort to establish a relationship up front with the people that I saw, and I was always open to new sort of stakeholders who were in fact knowledge users, to be connecting with them so that I could understand and reformulate my question. In some ways I was doing customer development, but not with customers as in purchasers, but customers as in people who really wanted to know how should they organize their efforts on behalf of homeless people with severe mental illness. So what were issues that were relevant to them? So in the sort of business vernacular, that being, what are the jobs that need to be done? What were headaches? And so one headache, for example, I'll give another example here, was you could house someone in an individual living accommodation, but unless you knew the risks for that particular individual, it could wind up that they, if you knew a little bit more personality-wise, you could probably predict behaviors that could be detected and sort of stopped early on before it was too late. So, for instance, people who might be inclined to use whatever means necessary to generate an income might sell everything in their apartment unless they had case management that was more sort of interacting on a day-to-day basis to monitor their behavior. So one of the things I worked on was a way of understanding results on personality assessment that would say, this person needs a lot more sort of day-to-day guidance. Otherwise, they could very easily create a situation where they will lose housing or get into a conflict with their peers. So to me, it was like very straightforward sort of thinking, but to implement it, it's kind of tricky because you're making predictions about behaviors that, although you're probably going to be right, it requires more sort of direct, confidence in that kind of research on the part of the knowledge users, right? So that's why it was really, for me, very important to start early on to involve that group as well. So basically what that boils down to is recommendations on what kind of housing and what level of support does this person need based on an assessment, not just of their diagnosis, but also of their behavioral sort of patterns, right? So again, something now that's become more relevant, in Los Angeles, homelessness issues now in the context of COVID become, they're a different set of questions, but really important to get in and talk with the knowledge users to help organize efforts on the behalf of that special needs population. There's one increment. Is there a question? Maybe that's a question. Maybe.
We have one question from Nancy. She asks, what are your thoughts about the next steps in your career?
First step is to fill that blank card. I really, it's so early in my role at Caltech. One of the things I like about this role is that I know it's going to evolve while I'm in it. And there are different, and it is a bridge role to the context externally. So, Ari is with Biocom, David Whelan from Bioscience LA. I work with a variety of different people from my role. And I really don't see myself moving anytime soon, although I probably said that about every job I've had. I really am. What I like to do now is to help people who have questions about what the next step in their careers are. Just Nancy, thank you for that question. I think where I'm gonna take it is a recommendation that I got from someone that I've used myself, and I would recommend it for anyone sort of considering a next step in their career. Namely, you do something for a while, and you usually, unless you don't like what you're doing, you're going to get good at it. So I'm going to assume you're good at what you're doing. But after a while, it could get tiring. You could get, that it doesn't have the same level of fulfillment. So you have a skill though, which might be partially useful in your next role. When you hear about a next role where, I get to use that, but I also get to learn a lot of cool new stuff that I want to learn about, right? And I think that has always been, so when I got this advice, I think, well, I think I'd like to believe that that's kind of how my sort of random walk through careers stages went. And I think there's enough truth in it to say, yes, that's probably a guiding principle. So one of the things I like teaching is design thinking, right? And in design thinking, it's a very flexible approach to sort of solving problems. It's very circular thinking. And as you can tell from this presentation, I can't avoid circular thinking. Anyway, it allows you to, it also sort of includes the importance of what they call a T-shaped personality. So you have depths in one area, but you also have the kind of skills and of connecting with other people, because one of the things in all of that link my efforts, and I began my talk with this too, is the importance of being a good team member. So a good team member knows their skills and knows when to hand off responsibilities to another team member, right? And I think so when you're considering a next career step, you might consider, okay, well, I'm good at this, they'll need a bit of that, but I'll get to learn something more, right? So you get to learn more. And that's kind of how I've moved in. And Nancy, in answer to your original question, if something pops up where I get to take what I've learned and connect it to a new area of learning, that's what's going to attract me. And that's what attracted me to move from UCI to Caltech, as a matter of fact, too. Yeah. Oh, wow. That was a good answer, because I got 2 more questions by the look of it, maybe. Or maybe not. Emily?
Yeah, we have another question. It's from Freddie. He asks, what is the most challenging aspect of KT that you've encountered?
Well, it's for me personally, it's I tend to be entrepreneurial and I want to get things done. And so that like one of the things you might have extracted from what I've presented so far is that I was impatient to see research results translated into new policy, new ways to work with people with severe mental illness. So I said, this is way too slow. I got to go. I want to work in a place where things happen more quickly. What better place than a hospital? So that's why when I was at director of research at St. Joe's Hospital. So the most difficult thing for me is to, personally, is to be patient and to think of the long game in times when you really have to do that. Right. So, and what's most frustrating is when you have pretty solid evidence that your knowledge, if it were to be translated, and you have an idea about how to do so, would improve the lot of your, the population you're trying to serve, and it's being, stymied by forces out of your control. So, for instance, in Boston, we had a wonderful evolving consumer household model for housing people with mental illness, and but it only lasted as long as we provided funding to keep it going, and the policymakers did not use it to keep that model going after our project. That was extremely frustrating. In some ways, maybe part of the reason why I moved to Canada from Boston, because I thought, they do socialized medicine, so there's more of a chance for uptake. But that's a separate, they're a separate block. So, Freddie, in answer to your question, it was, like when you feel like you're onto something and you just can't, you can't find the levers that allow it to come into being. Yeah. I didn't know. I just looked at my watch. I'm seeing it's 5:28. So so again, moving from knowledge mobilization. Well, this was the year of knowledge mobilization in retrospect, right? And even now, we need to figure out how to get people more confident and accepting of vaccinations, right? So, that's a knowledge, knowledge translation. I should stick with these things. Translational research, critical question right now. And one of the people that hugely impressed me was Daniel Chow. If you look him up, he's a physician at UCI, and I just his perspective right from the beginning of COVID throughout, and in fact, he's been a guest speaker already during my time at Caltech. I invited him to talk about monoclonal antibody treatments for COVID-19. Anyway, so yeah, you should check out some of his videos on, debunking myths about masks and things like that. He's an excellent communicator. So these slides are available, and I think one of the things I'd like you to do is take a look at this book. And I kind of said, if you read the synopsis of the talk before, I just read this book, and there's so many lessons in it that connect to, or illustrations of some of the points I've made on a very current topic. And it's got big personalities, and Walter Isaacson's really good at sort of putting this all together in a very sort of exciting way. So why don't I spend the last minute or two, I guess, any other questions that I can get to before we sign off, Emily?
Yes, there is one more question from Ari. I don't know, Ari, if you want to hop on and ask it, or do you want me to read off the question?
This might be a fully loaded question, but I was hearing
There's
you.
fully loaded as in guns, and there's fully loaded as in sandwiches, right? So, it's not.
Well, it's a very, very general question, but it's, it seems like from my research and from hearing you, there's a lot of challenges with transitional research. And so, I know there, I guess my one question is like, what improvements are you seeing, or what improvements need to take place, or problems that need to be solved to improve outcomes? And you can maybe focus on data collection or feedback loop or collaboration, because it seems like it takes a multidisciplinary team and a lot of moving parts, and there's a lot of data out there that might be
Yeah.
are misused.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and it's a multi-layered question too, and that's why I love this book. Part of the reason why I love this book is that it moves from basic mechanistic science to team-based approaches, rapid sort of collaboration to fight coronavirus, to detect it, to understand how do you test for it, how do you treat it. All of this, under one cover. And I think one of the things that, if we take, one of the lessons that we really have to distill or take with us going forward after this year is that the agility that it takes, when you use the word sprint early on, and, we need to be able to sprint to solutions and really, in a way, be flexible in terms of motivating people to do that. Funding is one way of motivating people, often referred to, but also de-risking paths going forward, making it clearer about how we'll move from EUAs, emergency use authorizations, to the regular business of the new FDA, because the new FDA will probably be the new FDA. How do we use the tools of science to synthesize information? So now, machine learning will be very effective. One of the things that Dr. Chow is working on is using machine learning on images to predict the course of COVID in a particular individual. So I think bringing all these tools to bear on a particular problem or a particular focus, we're better at that now. And I think one of the things that COVID did was to say, okay, let's change the rules, or let's lighten up on patents. Let people do research. We'll worry about that later. We got a problem to solve here, and we have multiple vaccines to choose from now. And no one predicted that. Well, maybe a few people were optimistic about that, but no one predicted that would be the case in less than a year. I don't know. Does that sort of answer your question, Harry?
That's great. Yeah, I appreciate it. There's a lot of ways places you could take that. So
yeah, I just want. I'm taking in the direction that people should read this book and see how get some answers to that question.
Perfect.